Imagine this. November 1923, Glasgow. You got the largest funeral the city had ever seen. Thousands upon thousands marching. Socialist anthems playing. Handel's March of Saul as well. Just as an incredible send-off. But this was for John Maclean, a figure who, despite this huge national moment, was often quite isolated. Really controversial, too, as our sources show. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really plunging into the life of John Maclean. It's often called the hero of Red Clydeside, an outstanding Marxist, a relentless fighter for the working class. Our mission here is to unpack how this teacher actually became such a fierce accuser of capitalism and how his life, didn't just reflect, but actually helped shape a really turbulent time. There's some crucial lessons here, I think, for understanding historical movements, societal change, and luckily our sources give us this really rich, detailed picture of his life and times. Okay, so to really get Maclean, we have to start with where he came from, right? Glasgow, turn of the 20th century. What was that environment like? The crucible he was forged in.
Yeah, it's fascinating, actually. The conditions were just so extreme. Glasgow was called the second city of the British Empire, but it was also described as an urban inferno. You're talking about 1 million people. That's like 20% of Scotland's whole population living in or right near the city. A lot of them had come from the Highlands because of the clearances Maclean's own parents included, or from Ireland. All drawn in to meet these huge industrial demands. Cotton, mining, shipbuilding. I mean, get this. Between 1904 and 1911, half the world's ships, the entire tonnage, was built on the Clyde.
Half. Oh, wow.
Yeah, incredible output. But the cost, the living conditions were, well, the sources say, utterly horrendous. Think about it. A third of the population in single-room slums. 10,000 women with no clear way to support themselves. 30,000 unemployed. And disease. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, TB, just rife, mostly down to poor diet, terrible sanitation. It was a really desperate situation for many.
So, yeah, absolutely fertile ground then for radical thinking, for new ideas. How did Maclean, coming from that background, find his way into the socialist movement? How did he start, trying to change things?
Well, his own family history with the Highland clearances definitely played a part. He became an avowed social democrat, which basically meant Marxist back then, around 1900 when he started teaching. Then in 1903, he joined the Marxist Social Democratic Federation, the SDF. He actually helped sort of resurrect the local SDF. He organized demos for the unemployed, got involved in trade unions, cooperatives, always as a revolutionary socialist. And he was out there doing intensive open-air propaganda all over the country in the summers. Then in winter, running classes on Marx, industrial history. You see his drive right from the start.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. He wasn't just an activist on the street corners. He was fundamentally an educator. Tell us about that impact as a teacher of Marxist ideas.
He was pretty exceptional in that role, yeah. He ran these regular classes explaining Marxist economics, capitalist exploitation. He used Marxist Capital as the main text. And what's amazing is the Eastwood School Board actually paid him the full teaching rate for these classes. And crucially, his classes pulled in shop stewards from engineering factories, from shipyards right across Glasgow. In 1915, which was a peak time with the rent strikes and everything, nearly 500 people attended his weekly Glasgow class. All the key shop stewards were there. He also trained up educators for the British Socialist Party, the BSP, who then ran classes across Scotland. So his reach really grew.
Wow, 500 people weekly. That's serious engagement.
It really was. And Willie Gallacher, who chaired the Clyde Workers' Committee, he wrote later, he said Maclean never dealt in abstract Marxism. He made it real. Gallacher said he demonstrated in the clearest manner that the war was a war for trade. He gave example after example. These examples were carried day after day into the factories. So it wasn't just theory, it was practical.
Right, making it relatable.
Exactly. And Mary Brooksbank, a poet from Dundee, she said she was spellbound by this man's oratory because he talked in a way that brought their own experiences to life. He connected with people.
And beyond the theory, he was really involved in the day-to-day workers' struggles too, wasn't he? What other kinds of issues did he champion?
Yes, absolutely. And he had this very sensitive approach towards women workers, which, wasn't always common in socialist groups back then. Like, he got involved in a strike at a cotton thread factory in Neilston, helped the women workers join the Women's Federation. He campaigned relentlessly for things like municipal public housing, public control over food safety, hygiene, common ownership of land, practical stuff. His pamphlet, The Greenock Jungle, exposed this awful scandal where diseased animal carcasses were being sold as food. That actually led to a meat inspector being appointed there. A concrete win.
So direct action leading to direct results.
Precisely. And his political strategy was interesting, too. He believed Marxists shouldn't be separate from the main working class movement. He argued for fighting alongside workers who were looking towards the Labor Party, or the ILP, the Independent Labor Party. Even while he was criticizing their, pro-capitalist policies, he believed in being in the struggle, not apart from it.
Okay, then comes the huge turning point, World War I. How did Maclean react to the outbreak of war? And what did that mean for the workers on Clydeside?
Well, this is where he really stands out. Unlike a lot of the big names in the Second International, that global socialist network who ended up supporting their own capitalist governments, Maclean just heroically refused to go along, full stop. He wrote back in September 1914 that it is our business as socialists to develop class patriotism. Basically, workers' loyalty should be to their class globally, not to the nation sending them to kill each other. He was one of just a handful of international revolutionaries like Lenin and Trotsky who opposed the war right from the start.
That must have been a very unpopular stance initially.
Oh, absolutely. There's a huge wave of jingoism, patriotic fervor, but Maclean wasn't deterred. He and his supporters kept organizing street meetings, sending speakers into the factories, the munitions works. Those weekly Sunday night anti-war meetings they held in Bath Street, they grew from hundreds to thousands. His argument was consistent. The war is just a continuation of the peacetime competition for trade and for markets. The real enemy, he said, was the employers. He never wavered on that.
So that anti-war feeling starts building up on Clydeside and emerges with other issues like housing, right? This leads to the whole Red Clydeside phenomenon. What were the key moments in that period? It sounds incredibly volatile.
It really was. The rumblings of discontent, as one source puts it, broke out properly in February 1915. There was an engineers' strike at Weirs of Cathcart over pay, and it just spread like wildfire through Glasgow. Now, this was unofficial action, and it was illegal under DORA, the Defense of the Realm Act. So to get around that, they elected a strike committee, this Central Labor Withholding Committee, that later became the Clyde Workers Committee, the CWC. And that CWC played a really leading role in the revolutionary events that followed.
Okay, so industrial action is kicking off. What about the housing side?
Right. So alongside that, you had huge pressure on housing because loads of workers were flooding in for war production. Landlords saw their chance and started hiking up rents. This sparked absolute mass anger, especially among women, many whose husbands were away fighting. Figures like Mary Barber emerged as leaders, particularly in Govan, which became this epicenter for rent strikes, for non-payment campaigns. Their tactics were brilliant. Tenants elected delegates. They used bells, whistles, drums, pots, pans, anything noisy to alert the whole tenement if eviction bailiffs showed up. There are stories of women literally covering the factors, the rent collectors, in flour and peas meal.
Flour and peas meal, that's direct action.
Absolutely. Real community defense. And Maclean was crucial here, too. He took the rent campaign into the shipyards, the factories, held gate meetings. He pushed for mass non-payment of all of the rent. Total solidarity. Things came to a head when 18 shipyard workers were summoned to court for not paying. A general strike was threatened. Willie Gallagher described the scene that day. From early morning, Mrs. Barber's army was on the march. Mighty reinforcements were coming from the workshops and the yards. Thousands turned out. Lloyd George, who was Minister of Munitions then, had to intervene directly, and they rushed through a Rent Restriction Act. It was a huge win, a massive victory, showed the incredible power the working class had when they organized, especially with women taking the lead.
A massive victory, yes, but it came at a real personal cost for Maclean, didn't it? The very same day that act was announced, he lost his teaching job because of his politics, and that seems to have marked the start of years of state repression against him.
That's right. It was almost immediate. First, he was jailed for 5 days in November 1915 under DORA, just for his anti-war work. But the state crackdown was much wider, hitting other CWC leaders, socialist papers too. Then in April 1916, he was charged with sedition. The trial sounds, well, pretty shaky. Police testimony based on notes that were apparently barely legible. They even misreported a joke he made about alarm clocks. But he was found guilty, sentenced to 3 years penal servitude, hard labor in Peterhead Prison.
3 years hard labor, that's brutal.
It was. But he didn't serve the full term. After 14 months, he was released in June 1917. Two big things fueled that release. A huge campaign demanding Maclean's release back home, huge pressure, and also the impact of the February Russian Revolution, which was just electrifying for the authorities and the movement. There was an 80,000-strong demonstration in Glasgow demanding his freedom. Even the All-Russian Congress of Workers and Soldiers delegates sent greetings to him in prison.
So international pressure as well, but his freedom didn't last long.
No, it was short-lived. By April 1918, he was back in court, charged with sedition again. This time, he defended himself, gave this incredible 75-minute speech from the dock. It's described as a masterclass in exposing capitalism and war, and it's where he delivered that famous line, "I am not here then as the accused. I am here as the accuser of capitalism dripping with blood from head to foot."
Powerful stuff. What was his argument?
He basically laid it all out. He argued capitalism is rotten to its foundations, that the war was purely about commercial rivalry. He even criticized the workers' own cacanny or go-slow tactics, saying they should aim higher. And he slammed the government for food shortages, for the deaths of women and children due to deprivation. Even though there were no workers on the jury, he appealed directly, exclusively to the working class, urging them to build one brotherhood. It was an amazing piece of political theater, really, turning his own trial into an indictment of the whole system.
And the sentence this time?
5 years imprisonment. But again, the context mattered. Fear of worker uprisings, the shadow of the Russian Revolution. He was released within just 7 months.
This pattern, arresting him, then releasing him under pressure. What does that tell you about how the government actually saw him?
It's revealing, isn't it? The prosecutor, Lord Advocate Clyde, apparently first thought Maclean was more or less a lunatic, but he had to acknowledge Maclean's considerable influence. He saw him as a dangerous enemy, especially with those links to the international revolutionary situation. So you have to ask, was the government really concerned about his mental state, as they sometimes implied? Or was it pure fear of his power to mobilize the working class? The actions suggest the latter. They knew he was a threat.
Yeah, that seems likely. And speaking of those international connections, his ties to the Russian Revolution seem incredibly deep. How exactly did the Bolsheviks recognize him? What was his role there?
Oh, the news of the Bolshevik Revolution absolutely set alight the Clyde. It was huge. Maclean had already positioned himself with the anti-war internationalists at the Zimmerwald Conference back in 1915. That was a key meeting laying groundwork for a new revolutionary international. Lenin himself, as early as 1916, called Maclean a brave fighter, a heroic forerunner, high praise. Then, in 1918, came the really big honors. He was elected honorary president of the first All-Russian Congress of Soviets, alongside Lenin and Trotsky themselves. And maybe even more remarkably, he was appointed as the Bolshevik Consul in Glasgow. Think about that, the first ever representative of Soviet Russia in Britain.
Bolshevik Consul in Glasgow. Did that actually function?
Well, not really in practice. The British government refused to recognize his consulate, naturally. They seized funds sent to him, returned his mail, basically shut it down. But Maclean didn't let that stop him. He just threw himself back into mass activity. His daughter Nan Milton wrote about it vividly. Wherever workers gathered, at the street corners, at the pit heads, at the factory gates, even at football parks, he was there. And wherever he went, he lit fires of revolt. He just kept going.
So Maclean gets out of prison again at the end of 1918. The war is over. This sounds like a real high point for the revolutionary movement on the Clyde. Yeah. What happened next, given all that momentum?
You'd think so. And there were huge demands for real change now the war was done. A shorter working week was a big one. They wanted 40 hours, down from the typical 54 on the Clyde. So in January 1919, about 500 shop stewards and union leaders agreed to call a general strike for January 24th. It shut down the main shipyards, the big engineering shops. Huge participation. Then, on January 31st, thousands gathered in George Square in the city center. Things turned violent. Police charged with batons. There were huge battles reported. The government got scared. They brought in troops, not just from Scotland, but from England, too. And get this, Winston Churchill, who was Secretary of State for War then, ordered local soldiers, guys just back from the war station at Maryhill Barracks, to be locked up because they couldn't trust them, feared they'd side with the strikers.
Locked up their own returning soldiers. That shows how tense things were.
Extremely tense. In the end, a deal was struck for a 47-hour week, and the strike was called off. Willie Gallagher, looking back, famously admitted, "We were carrying out a strike when we ought to have been making a revolution." Quote, and one of our sources makes a strong point here, arguing the lack of a Bolshevik-type party in Scotland at that specific moment was a decisive factor in why things didn't escalate into a full-blown revolution.
Okay, the lack of a Bolshevik-type party, that's a specific point from the source. What exactly does that mean was missing? Why was that seen as so crucial? And how does that connect to Maclean's own choices later, like not joining the Communist Party and his shift towards Scottish independence?
That's a really central question. What they mean by a Bolshevik-type party is a unified, disciplined organization, a vanguard party with a clear revolutionary plan, ready to provide centralized leadership to turn that mass anger and strike action into an actual bid for power. The Clyde Workers' Committee was powerful, yes, but it wasn't that kind of political party. It was more of a coordinating body for industrial action. And yeah, this ties directly into Maclean's later decisions. He famously refused to join the new Communist Party of Great Britain when it was founded in 1920. He wrote this open letter to Lenin explaining why, calling its early members a heterogeneous mix of anarchists, sentimentalists, syndicalists, with a sprinkling of Marxists. Basically, he didn't think it had the right ideological clarity or leadership.
So he felt the new party wasn't up to scratch, ideologically.
Seems so. And it's around this time he starts really pushing for Scottish independence, for a Scottish Workers' Republic. Now, the wider labor movement in Scotland did support Home Rule, but Maclean going for full independence, the source we're looking at calls that a mistake at that particular time. The reasoning given is that it was based on an overly pessimistic assessment of the revolutionary potential among workers in England and Wales, that he was isolating the Scottish struggle.
Right. The source frames it as a potential mistake.
Yeah.
But are there other ways to look at his reasoning? Did Maclean himself see it differently? Maybe strategically?
Oh, absolutely. He definitely saw it strategically. He viewed an independent Scotland not as an end in itself, but as a detonator for world revolution. He said things like, "We can make Glasgow a Petrograd. A Scottish breakaway at this juncture would bring the empire crashing down and free the waiting workers of the world." Strong stuff. He envisioned the Scottish Workers' Republic being joined in one big industrial union with their British comrades. So internationalist in its ultimate aim, but nationalist in its immediate tactic. It's complex. And the source does note that debates still rage on the left about Maclean's mental state in these final years. Some historians point to his claims about being poisoned in prison as evidence of paranoid delusions perhaps brought on by his treatment, but others argue his criticisms of the Communist Party leaders, for instance, were actually sharp and prescient. It's part of what makes him such a debated figure.
It really is complex, and his life was just lived at such an intensity, at the edge of human limits, as one source puts it. Tragically, all that struggle, the imprisonments, the hunger strikes, the force-feeding it, took a massive toll on his health.
It really did. He died incredibly young, just 44, in November 1923. Probably from malnutrition and pneumonia, exacerbated by sheer exhaustion. Apparently, he was still holding outdoor meetings in the freezing Glasgow weather right up until the end. Just wouldn't stop.
44. Just incredible dedication, but a terrible personal cost.
Yeah. But his funeral, as we mentioned at the start, that massive turnout cemented his status. He was honored internationally, too, streets named after him in Soviet cities, even a Soviet postage stamp with his face on it. There are attempts to kind of downplay or erase his legacy over the years. A manuscript by his first biographer was apparently lost. But his daughter, Nan Milton, really pushed for a revival from the 1970s onwards. And theater, songs like Alistair Hewlett's brilliant songs about him have kept his memory very much alive.
He's definitely remembered often as this almost Marxist saint, seen as key to Glasgow's whole radical and red self-image. Yet, as we've discussed, he's full of these contradictions. Highlander and lowlander, nationalist and internationalist, pacifist roots but revolutionary action. A really fascinating mix.
Undeniably. His impact is just huge. That inscription on his memorial cairn in Pollokshaws sums it up. He forged the Scottish link in the golden chain of world socialism. He was truly exceptional, wasn't he? In his sheer tenacity, his endurance, his absolute determination to liberate the oppressed. His life, as one source says, it opens revolutionary possibilities and potential in legend. He becomes more than just a historical figure.
So, thinking about all this,
Yeah.
what can you listening really take away from Maclean's often turbulent, quixotic life? A life that in many ways still continues to shape Scotland and the left. Maybe consider that core belief he lived by, captured in Edwin Morgan's poem, "We are out for life and all that life can give us." How might that relentless drive for a better world, even facing immense personal costs, seemingly impossible odds, how might that resonate with how you navigate our own complex world today? Something to think about.